Materials provided by Fredericks and Winsor Newton.
There are a lot of different kinds of paint to use, and one of them I think that gets overlooked is acrylic paint. The problem with it, I think, is that it's usually the first paint taught and it's in almost every high school art class, but it's not often examined or taught to the extent that it could be. So I think a lot of people have the mindset that acrylic is kind of like entry-level paint, it's the starting paint. There's a lot of good qualities to it. It's pretty quick drying, so it's easy to work with. Also, the plastic-based nature of it, it's very permanent. You don't have to worry about toxins or chemicals or anything like that. And with things that are a little bit more nuanced in it, like blending mediums and different kinds of colors and how to mix them, acrylic can actually be a very workable medium. The first question is, what colors do I start with? Don't just head there and get every color available. You'd be spending a lot of money, and it gets you into the habit of not mixing your paint. It's always good to start with a limited palette just to get a feel for the medium and see if you enjoy it. Then if you do, then you can get yourself some nicer Series 4 colors in a wider range. To start with, there are just a few basic colors that are a great starter pack for any acrylic painting. Naples yellow, definitely. Payne's gray, then a richer red like a cadmium red or maybe an alizarin crimson, then raw umber, burnt sienna, and then let's throw cobalt blue. It's a little bit nicer of a blue, but it's worth it. I wouldn't recommend your starting set including either black or white, because I think it gets you into the habit of using black for shadows and white for highlights, which can really dull your paint and your color. You want to start getting into the habit of learning how to use things like Payne's gray or Naples yellow to brighten or darken things. When you're ready, a couple extra colors that are nice to have but not necessarily essential are permanent rose, which once you incorporate it, you'll want to use nothing else, cobalt green, and something called mixing white. Mixing white is a really cool element for acrylic paint where it doesn't dull the color as much, but it helps to lighten it a little bit. Titanium white, which is another color to add if you really find yourself enjoying acrylic paint, is very punchy, strong white. But the downside is it does mute the colors. Of course, that's a great thing to use if you know how to use it, but with any painting you don't want to start with something like titanium white in your palette because it's too tempting to use it. For example, if you're painting a room like this and you're looking at the white on the wall, it's very tempting to not think about it and just go, that's white, I'm going to paint it white. And that problem happens all the time if you're starting painting. Like if you're painting a red apple, reach for the red. One of the things that a limited palette can do is train your eye to kind of see the more subtle colors in it. Since acrylic paint dries so quickly and is so hard to get out, it's not really a good idea to get a store-bought plastic palette, the kind of thing I'd use for most other paints. You can go two routes. You can either get a more expensive and more permanent glass palette, which you can have for years, or you can use freezer paper. Freezer paper is terrific. It's exactly the same material as those expensive temporary palettes you find at art supply stores, but it's so cheap. And it's simply just like wax paper, it's a little bit of glossy, and it works really well for a short-term temporary palette to just throw out when you're done. Freezer paper is really great, of course, because it's on a roll, so you can make your palette as large or as small as you want. And you can always tear off a new sheet if your palette gets too busy or crowded. Winsor & Newton makes some really great mediums and blending tools that help with that. For example, they make a slow drying medium, which if you're frustrated like I was that acrylic paint dries just too quickly, this is really good to incorporate in the palette for, say, mixing a large amount of a color and incorporating this to increase the longevity of that. It's also really good to kind of add some transparency so you can do more layers, more washes over, without watering it down with water. The key reason you're going to want to use mediums like this matte medium, which thins out the paint without decreasing the color value, a lot of people try to use water. They just soak their brush and then hydrate the acrylic paint. But the problem is that it's all chemistry when you make a paint. It's the combination of a binder and a pigment. For acrylic paint, plastic plays a big role in that. And when you use water, what you're doing is affecting the chemical balance. So the color can wash out, or the pigment can even begin to separate. And at the end of the day, it affects how permanent the painting that you're making is. The great thing about these mediums is they don't affect the chemistry of the paint themselves. In my case, I think they're necessary for me enjoying acrylic paint. The reason that acrylic paint is taught as a safe alternative to oil paint is because it is. Now granted, there are a lot of things that make acrylic different from oil in technique, but one big thing is it's virtually non-toxic. Please don't eat it. It is not safe to eat. But as far as the dangers go, it's really just getting it on your clothes and staining it. It doesn't emit any toxic fumes. Of course, you don't want to mess around with cadmiums too much, just like with all paints. But as far as fumes or any sort of toxic thing you need to worry about, acrylic is really pretty safe. Whether you have a nice brush or a cheap brush, you want to get into the habit of practicing good brush cleaning technique. Because especially with acrylic paint, once it dries, and you have to be diligent about keeping your brushes and taking care of them. It's really easy to have, say with watercolor, brushes that you can have for years and not worry too much about it because watercolor is water soluble. But acrylic paint, once it dries, that plastic paint is stuck on the bristles and you're done. So you have to get into the habit of washing out your brushes while you're painting in clean water, and then when you're done, cleaning them with dish soap and cold water. If you use hot water, that helps to bind the acrylic paint to the bristles more, whereas cold water doesn't. I like acrylic paint because it has a natural kind of painterly quality. I really like the effect of dry brush. However, know how you paint and know what your goals are with it. With the incorporation of some mediums or really working with the colors, anything is possible with acrylic. I know acrylic painters who don't use any mediums and their paints can look completely different than mine do. You have a lot of tools at your disposal for acrylic, and you need to choose which ones will help suit you as an artist. As far as the tactile feel of acrylic paint goes, never forget that it's plastic-based, and it feels like that. It's very thick, which leads to a really good kind of dry brush technique, and it's really good for painting with the palette knife as well. You can either paint it very thickly, and because it dries so quickly, you can really build up layers on the canvas and really make a nice, thick texture of paint. Or you can use a lot of the blending mediums and slow dry mediums and make it very thin and wash-like. So it's really flexible depending on where you want it to go. Since acrylic is so thick and so naturally opaque, I'll start all my paintings in acrylic with a pencil sketch beneath, because I have no doubt that it's all going to be covered over with even the first layer of paint. The reason I use a pencil and not just lines of acrylic paint is because of the thickness of the texture that the acrylic would provide. If I did an underpainting with thick lines drawn in acrylic paint, there would be those thick lines present in the final image. So if you apply a line of acrylic paint in the underpainting and it has a really thick texture to it, if you paint thinly, that will always be apparent there. However, if you paint thickly and you really like to glob on the acrylic paint, you don't need to worry about it that much. For acrylic brushes, there's a whole range of size and style of brushes, anything from as big as this to as small as this. And of course, each one has its own different particular use. The difference between the acrylic and oil brush is subtle, but it's a big difference when you're painting. The oil brush is very thick bristled, very stiff, whereas the acrylic brush is soft, nylon, which helps with the flow of the paint. I really like using a wide brush for the underpainting, locking in those big colors, and also to get more painterly when I'm applying things even in detail, if I just want to use a suggestion of something. I'll use these really nice thin round ones to make small patterns, small details, really tiny moments of highlights. You start to find the method you use acrylic paint, which I can't stress enough that acrylic paint is flexible enough that you can find a way to make it suit your painting style. It's not as much of a problem with acrylic because the paint dries so quickly, but it doesn't dry fast enough to avoid the problem of muddy colors. The key, of course, is always to just be patient and intentional when you're mixing. You don't want to mix all the colors together and then just end up with a big glop of mystery color, nor do you want to apply wet paint onto an area with wet paint on the canvas. You want to take your time, be patient, and always keep your eye in tuned to what color you're painting and mixing that correctly. And underpainting is that first step in the painting, when you're just blocking out the basic shapes, the basic colors, sometimes basic tone. When I use acrylic painting, I really like to do the underpainting in the complementary colors of the subject that I'm seeing. For example, this lobster which I've left unfinished, the underpainting, it was just a glob of blue, which of course is the complementary color of that reddish orange the lobster is. The reason I do this is because it can really quickly give you some nice color complexity as you go forward. Take this turnip, which was mostly yellow in color at its core. The underpainting was a very soft light purple. You can see little spotches where I applied the paint very dryly, and you can see the purple beneath it. Also, it helps you to train your eye and really notice those colors. It keeps you from being like, this turnip is white. It's like, no, what's the opposite of that? After I do the underpainting, I don't worry about tone or value in that. I'm just looking at the complementary colors. The second layer, I start to incorporate the real color of the image and also focusing a little bit more on tone and value and shading. And when I start that layer, I like to get the middle grounds in first and then start applying the lightest light and the darkest dark. So when I use a different medium, I do it because that medium brings something to the table that I otherwise wouldn't have. As I'm painting, it's really up to me at any given moment whether or not I want to use a lot of slow dry medium to get a nice thin layer and do some nice layers of color, or if I want to just get the palette knife and apply really thick swabs of the color. And I like how acrylic is very flexible in that way, where you can change the style of paint even halfway through. Using a palette knife to paint with acrylic is a really cool technique, and it helps you get a little looser and helps you focus on the color. So whether you do a full painting with just the palette knife to practice that, or you use palette knife painting to kind of work in, like over here, this was applied with the palette knife, and you can see it has a really cool, exciting texture and a very loose, exciting feel. I use details in paintings to help focus the eye, pay attention to the focal point. I use details for that. And in order to get those, since acrylic is also naturally dry, I make sure to use some of this matte medium to smooth it out, and then it helps me kind of really get a fine point in that. Of course, one of the big benefits of acrylic is that you can just keep applying layer after layer, but that also comes at a cost where you can get really fussy and just always want to keep going and it's never perfect. And with acrylic, you really have to get yourself in that mindset of appreciate the kind of happy accidents that can come from it. For example, I didn't really plan on this turnip having so much of the underpaint showing, but I really enjoy the effect it has. Look at some of the abstract nature that can come from a painting technique and think, you know what, I really enjoy how that looks. Long-term care for acrylic is really easy because it's a plastic-based paint, so it won't eat away at the canvas and it won't really start to rot. Of course, you'll want to varnish the paint when you're done anyway. So a problem with all painting mediums is that some colors dry shiny and some dry a little more matte, and the root of that is always the pigment. And using varnish is a good way to kind of even things out. You know, that's why I start with a coat of semi-gloss or gloss varnish, because everything then becomes shiny and it kind of unifies the piece. Winsor Newton makes great varnish, and I always like to apply first a coat of gloss or semi-gloss and then a coat of matte. And it just has a nice extra layer of protection, and the gloss has a really nice look, whereas the layer of matte on top keeps it from being too shiny, so it's so hard to photograph. Of course, it's possible to just use gloss or semi-gloss varnish for your painting, and that does have a really nice look in person. However, it is very difficult to photograph because the glare can get so strong. So I know some artists who they don't varnish their piece until after they photograph it, which is a good solution around the problem. Just because acrylic can dry fast, it doesn't mean that it's a fast way of painting. In order to get it done well and to really work with the medium, it takes a couple hours, 3 to 4 hours to do like a nice small painting with it. So you still have to be patient with the application of the medium, letting it dry, and getting the painting to where you want it to be. It's very thick, so really quickly...
Sorry, I'm trying to hold it in.
Oh, no worries. Using a palette knife for painting with acrylic is a nice little tool in your sleeve.
I just love it when you
Trick
mess
in
up,
your
Alex,
belt.
because you never mess up.
Sorry, frog in my throat.